One of the ways that the wealthy build generational wealth using the financial system is that they borrow against their assets. In this video, I want to talk to you about whether you should borrow against your Bitcoin and whether the legacy financial systems methods work with Bitcoin. Let's get started. I want to start with a post that I made just explaining what mortgages are. So this is a post that I made on X on March 20th of 2023. 90% of all millionaires become so through owning real estate. Andrew Carnegie. This is a post that I made before I would say that I was truly orange pilled. And I don't quite agree with everything that I said in this post, but I still think that this is important to know because this can help you with making better decisions with your Bitcoin so that you can at some point maybe borrow against your Bitcoin and not have to sell it to pay for your expenses. And I think it's really important to look at this from multiple different perspectives. You have to look at the negatives, the positives. You have to look at how the real estate market works with mortgages. You have to look at how Bitcoin lending works. So you have to learn a lot of things in order to make the right decision on whether you should borrow against your Bitcoin. One of the things that you have to know about mortgages is that for most people, getting a mortgage is the only way to buy a house. If you want to buy a house in Canada, for example, nobody has 900,000, $1 million sitting in their bank account to buy a house with cash. So everybody is borrowing money against their house and they're buying that house, no matter what the price is. Even if they do have cash sitting around, they'll still take on a mortgage because they'll use that cash to buy other assets. So we can see here, a mortgage is money borrowed to purchase real estate. The loan is secured by physical land and buildings. So in this case, we know that the lender is protected if the borrower stops paying back whatever they owe. They can just sell the property and they can get their money back. The issue here that I think this is something that I didn't really think about back then is that lenders aren't protected in case the value of the property falls. So let's say if the mortgage is $500,000 and the property value initially was, let's say, 700,000. So the buyer put down $200,000 and they borrowed $500,000 to pay for the house. Let's say the property's value drops to $350,000 and the borrower just stops paying. They lose their job. Something happens in the market where they can no longer pay back their mortgage. The lender may still have, let's say, $450,000 on their balance sheet that they're owed because the principal may not have been paid down enough. So let's say if the buyers lose their jobs within the first couple of years, the amount that they owe the lender will probably still be pretty high. It'll probably still be over 450, over $475,000. But the value of the house has dropped to 350,000. So now the lender is in a difficult position. So this is something that I don't think I had considered back here. I mean, it's an important thing to consider, but who really thinks that real estate is going to go down in value if they've been pretty much brainwashed by the legacy financial system? I would say that I was at this point brainwashed by the legacy financial system. I thought real estate values always go up. So I hadn't really considered that here. So you see here, lenders profit from charging interest on the money they lend. They create money out of nothing. They give that money to a borrower. The borrower goes and buys a house and then they pay back the lender. So whatever the spread is there is the profit that the lenders make. Since mortgages have collateral, interest rates on mortgages are lower than personal loans, less risk. The issue with real estate, of course, is that every property is different. It also takes a lot of time to sell the property. So if you're a lender and you lend money against the value of a house, you don't know what the real value of that house would be. It's subjective. The value of a house is subjective. The problem here is that the value of houses based on location, based on the features that they have, based on, let's say, the number of garages that they have, based on what's beside them, it can change. It's subjective. You have to have inspections done. Everybody could have a different opinion of what the value may be. Even if you value the house against comparables, you may not get an accurate measure of what the value of a house could be. So we can see here, since the house is collateral, the bank is relying on being able to sell the property for either the same amount as the loan or more because they just expect that the value will go up. But it's possible that that specific house or the area that house is in could lose a significant amount of value for whatever reason. So the lenders may never get their money back in this case. And the difference between secured and unsecured debt is massive. So the amount of interest that you'll pay for a credit card may be 20 to 30%, but on a mortgage, you may only pay 6%. So this is part of the reason why the system is rigged against poor people. It's rigged to make it so that if poor people want to borrow money, they don't have any assets, they have to pay 20 to 30%. While if a rich person wants to borrow money, they can pay 6%. The chances of somebody who has no assets investing the money that they borrow and succeeding are much lower because the barrier to entry is much higher. That person with no assets has to make a lot more money in order to compete with the people who have assets and they can borrow at 6%. And this is one of the reasons why the legacy financial system is rigged against poor people. So if you have a house, you can go and borrow money against that house. Your bank can create more money out of thin air and give it to you, and you can use it to buy more houses or to buy whatever you want to pay for your lifestyle. So what the lender does is they give the borrower a specific amount of time, a certain period where they can pay back the loan. So in this case, we see here the principal of the mortgage is the amount being borrowed and is amortized or paid off over time. The borrower makes a payment on a regular schedule for a certain period. So no matter what happens, they're going to make this payment. They're going to keep making this payment. So in a way, a mortgage is almost like a bond where the lender is lending money and the borrower is making payments over time. The lender is basically guaranteed a certain interest rate. They have to take risk. Of course, they have to take the risk of potentially having the property value drop. But we know that in the current financial system, real estate properties don't drop in value because there's more and more dollars that are going to be pumped into the system no matter what, pumping up the price of housing. So in this case, this is basically like a free bond for the bank. They aren't taking that much risk. They have a property that they can sell in case they need to. And a small portion of every payment goes back to the principal. So what happens is in the beginning, the borrower is just continuously paying back interest, paying back interest. So the bank is making free money in the beginning for doing literally nothing. They just update an entry in their books, in their back end, and they give this money out to the person. And now they can buy a house. And this is part of what makes the legacy financial system so rigged against poor people. The wealthy can buy as many houses as they want to. Houses are a necessity. People need them to live. They need them to survive. They need shelter. The wealthy can buy as many houses as they want to, and they can rent them out to other people who can't afford to buy a house. The mortgage payments, these payments are being paid by the tenant, meaning that there's wealth being transferred from the tenant over to the landlord. This is what happens when the things that we need on a daily basis become financialized. People start using the necessities of other people to make free money. The landlords are basically making free money because they know that the legacy financial system is designed to pump up prices of real estate. So the people who take the risk of borrowing money and buying a house because they know that the price of houses are going to go up forever, the people who take this risk become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. This thread does continue, but it's a little bit of a different topic. I started talking about whether mortgages are good debt and some questions that you should ask yourself before you get a mortgage. I'll link the thread in the description below. You can go ahead and read it on your own time. The legacy financial system is rigged against people who don't own real estate. And of course, I explained it before. If you don't have a house, you can't borrow against something and you have to pay a much higher interest rate in order to borrow money. This is partly why a lot of poor people become poorer and poorer over time. I used to do free one-on-one sessions way back when I just started creating content and I had no audience. I used to speak with people who had credit card debt with 30% interest. They had car loans paying 28% interest. They'd have payday loans where they're paying 300% interest on a very small amount. They borrowed, let's say, $1,000, and over time they're going to pay $5, $10, $15,000 if they just keep making the minimum payments. Taking on debt as a consumer is one of the worst things that you can do, but if you take on debt as a investor, I think you're going to do extremely well. So in the current global financial system, if you have a house, you are the king because you can borrow against that house. Your bank will create more money. It'll lend it to you at very cheap rates because they have collateral. You can use that house as collateral to borrow money against it. Because real estate is being used as collateral, housing has become a financial asset. So people don't buy houses to live in. They buy houses because they think that houses are their retirement plan. I've mentioned some stats before about how in the US and in Canada, something like 10% of houses are unoccupied. Why would people just hold houses that are unoccupied? If they didn't expect the value of the house to go up over time, they wouldn't hold these houses. They would sell them. They would allow somebody to develop them, to make them better so that they can be lived in. But you can't overlook the value of just holding houses and not even living in them. You just buy them and you sit on them, and the value goes up, and you can borrow more and more money against them. You can take on a bigger and bigger mortgage against that house. And I want to show you exactly how this works. So if you have a property that's worth $500,000, you borrow $400,000 against it, you have a loan to value of 80%. So the loan compared to the value of the asset is 80%. Let's say over time you pay down some of the amounts that you owe on that house. Your total borrowed amount goes down to $350,000. And at the same time, because more and more money keeps being added to the system, more and more people want to buy houses, the value of the house goes up. So instead of being $500,000, the value of the house is now $650,000. The loan to value has dropped to 54%. So what the bank will do is it'll lend you money on the 26%. That brings you back to 80% for your loan to value. So let me explain. Because your loan to value has dropped to 54%, the bank will give you another $169,000 loan to bring your loan to value back up to 80%. So if you add these two numbers up, you're going to get 80%. We can see that here. Your total loan will be 80% of the value of the house. So as you pay down the house, as you pay down your mortgage, or your tenants pay down your mortgage, the amount of money that you've borrowed has fallen, and you can now reuse that amount of money to borrow again. And as the value of the house goes up, it almost feels like the amount of collateral that you gave to the bank has increased. The bank will reassess your property and they'll give you a bigger loan. So when we have a system like this where the wealthy can buy houses, the value of the houses they buy go up forever, and they get to borrow money that's decreasing in value forever, we can see where the problems come from. The wealthy get richer, the poor get poorer. When we have a system like this, we can see the divide between the wealthy and the poor. The poor get poorer because they have to work in order to earn devaluing currency, while the rich just get to hold on to assets and they get to go play golf and they get to go chill on their yachts while they get wealthier and wealthier. This is what the system is designed to do. So over 30 years, let's say you rent this person's house. You've paid them $500,000 in terms of rent, so their mortgage has dropped to zero. At the same time, the value of the house has gone to $1,000,000. So they now have a line of credit for $800,000. So the bank will want to bring the LTV back up to 80%. Now the person who owns that house can borrow even more money against that house. They can borrow 80% of the current value of the house minus anything that they've borrowed. This is how the wealthy turn, let's say, $100,000 down payment into $1,000,000 over 20 to 30 years. They can now go and borrow $800,000 against this house that they initially only put $100,000 of their own money into. So now let's talk about borrowing against your Bitcoin. I used to be against it. I used to think that if we don't borrow against our Bitcoin, if we don't feed the current financial system, if we don't make it more powerful, give them our assets, use them as collateral, and borrow fiat, then I thought that we could change the financial system quickly. But I don't know if I still agree with that. I think most people will have their blinders on pretty much forever. They're not going to buy Bitcoin until they're forced to buy Bitcoin, or they're going to interact with only a layer on top of Bitcoin. So they're not going to get all of the benefits of being able to borrow against Bitcoin. I thought that if people don't borrow against their Bitcoin, then the system becomes more fair. And I don't know if I agree with this anymore. I don't think people want it to become fair. I think a lot of people just want to complain and they want to argue about why the system is getting worse. And they don't want to look at these solutions that are right in front of them, which is to buy Bitcoin. What Bitcoin does is instead of only allowing the wealthy to have assets that they can borrow against, Bitcoin allows anybody in the world to borrow against their assets. So, for example, if you were to buy $10 worth of Bitcoin today and at some point it goes to $100, you can now borrow, let's say, $20, $30 against that Bitcoin. This may not seem like a lot of money to people in North America, but let's say in Africa or places like India, this is a lot of money. Over time, the value of the Bitcoin will continue to rise. It'll go from 100 to 150 to 200 to 250 to 300 to 500 to 1,000. And the people who bought that Bitcoin will be able to borrow more and more money against the Bitcoin that they own. I think this evens the playing field because anybody in the world who has access to a cell phone can borrow against their Bitcoin. At some point, I do think that the fiat currency financial system is going to fall apart. I don't think people are going to want fiat because fiat is essentially worthless. But in the meantime, why would you sell your Bitcoin to BlackRock? Why would you sell it to Fidelity? Why would you sell it to MicroStrategy? I don't think that the strategy works exactly the same as it would with real estate, though. With real estate, you can have a loan to value of 80%. So you can borrow 80% of the value of the real estate that you own. With Bitcoin, the loan to value is significantly lower because the loans that you have with Bitcoin will be marked to market. Mark to market is a method of accounting that values assets and liabilities at their current market price rather than their historical price. This means that the value of the asset is updated to reflect its current market value, providing a more accurate and real time view of an entity's financial position. With real estate, the asset is not marked to market. So if the real estate market drops and you keep making your payments, then the bank isn't going to come after you to make your mortgage payments faster. They'll allow you to keep making your payments even if the value of the house drops, because in the legacy financial system, money can be made out of thin air, meaning that if market values drop too much, banks are at risk. So the government and the central banks will all collude and they'll create more money and they'll flood the economy with it. They'll lower interest rates so more people can buy houses and pump the prices of housing up. With Bitcoin, you do have to use mark to market accounting because Bitcoin's price is so much more volatile than real estate's. In a single night, Bitcoin's price could fall 5%, 10%. We could see a drop of 50 to 80% within a year. With real estate, you're not going to see something like this. You're not going to see a drop of 50, 60% over a year because it takes time for that price to fall. It takes a lot of time to sell a property. So for people to panic sell is nearly impossible. They can't just sell their property within a day, bring the prices of houses down, but over time it could happen. So the risk with Bitcoin is that if the market price of your collateral goes down too much, then your lender may have to sell your Bitcoin in order to recover whatever money they lent you. You still have whatever they lent you. So let's say you went and bought a house with the money that you borrowed against your Bitcoin. You still have that house, but the lender is going to sell whatever you used as collateral to back up that loan to buy that house. With Bitcoin, instead of having a 80% loan to value, so if you have $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, you won't be able to borrow 80% of it. So your loan to value again is the amount that you borrowed, so $500 divided by the Bitcoin value, so the collateral that you provide. So in this case, let's say you borrow $200 against your Bitcoin. You have $1,000 worth of Bitcoin that you use as collateral. Your loan to value is 20%. Generally, what your lenders may do is if your loan to value reaches a certain level, they may start selling your Bitcoin in order to cover your loan. So in this case, if the value of your Bitcoin collateral were to fall by 30% to $700, your loan to value would drop to 29%. It's just you're borrowed against your Bitcoin value. If it were to drop to $500, then you'd have a 40% loan to value. If it were to drop to $300, you'd have a 66% loan to value, 67%. If it were to drop to $250, you would have an 80% loan to value. And this is where most lenders will start liquidating some of your Bitcoin. So if your Bitcoin drops to, let's say, $240, your lender will have to sell some of your Bitcoin in order to cover some of your loan to bring this back down to 80%. The issue with this is that once they're done selling, you may end up with very little Bitcoin. So let's say the value of your Bitcoin drops to $240. The Bitcoin that you used as collateral drops to $240. You borrowed $200 against it. They would have to probably sell something like $50 worth of Bitcoin in order to bring you back to 80%. So if they sell $50 worth of Bitcoin, you've lost something like 20% of your stack and the money was partially paid back. So now your loan to value drops to 79%. This is something that you have to be really careful of because if Bitcoin's value drops below a certain level, your lender is going to start selling and you may end up with very little Bitcoin. So if you borrow against your entire stack, let's say you have $1,000 worth of Bitcoin and you borrow $800 against it, as soon as Bitcoin's price falls 1%, they're going to start selling your Bitcoin. This is why you should probably have a lower loan to value with Bitcoin. You may want to only borrow, let's say, $300 against your entire stack. Keep in mind, if Bitcoin's value drops something like 50% from here, you're going to be very close to being liquidated. So you don't want to borrow against your whole stack because your entire stack may be sold just to cover your loan. Something else that you have to know is that right now, borrowing against your Bitcoin is a little bit more expensive than borrowing against your real estate. It's right in the middle of real estate and credit cards where you have secured versus unsecured. Bitcoin is right in the middle. So the loans that I've seen are about 12, 13, 14%. You can borrow against your Bitcoin up to 50% of the value of that Bitcoin you can borrow for 12% per year. If you were to borrow that money and let's say buy Bitcoin, you would do pretty well because let's say Bitcoin's value keeps rising by 50% per year. Of course, there are going to be periods where Bitcoin's value drops, but if it keeps rising over time, then you're going to see that the amount that you owe is going to decrease compared to the amount of Bitcoin that you have. Before we talked about the negative scenario where if Bitcoin's price drops, now we can look at the positive scenario. So in this case, you borrow 50% of the value of your Bitcoin, which is $1,000. You borrow $500. Let's say the value of that Bitcoin goes to $1,500. You're going to see that your loan to value has now dropped to 33%. So in this case here, you can borrow another $250 just because the value of your Bitcoin has increased. Now let's say the value of your Bitcoin goes to $3,000. You went from being able to borrow $500 to being able to borrow $1,500. You basically made money out of nothing. You created money out of thin air. You've gone to some institution, you told them that you have this asset, you gave them that asset, they now hold that asset, and they're willing to give you money against that asset. If you aren't willing to pay them back, then they get to sell the asset and they get to take their money back. So let's say you borrow $1,500 against this Bitcoin. You now have $1,500 in cash and you have $3,000 worth of Bitcoin. Let's say Bitcoin's price drops 50%. At this point, the lender will have liquidated your loan, but you still have $1,500 worth of whatever you borrowed. You started with $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, but now you have $1,500 worth of value that was transferred to you. This is how Bitcoin evens the playing field between somebody who has real estate versus somebody who has Bitcoin. The people who have Bitcoin can now borrow against that Bitcoin and they can use it as collateral and they can start their own businesses. They can get their own education. They can do whatever they really want to enjoy their lives or to improve their lives. One of the things that we're going to experience in our lifetimes is the interest rates on Bitcoin are going to decrease because over time, as banks become more aware of how Bitcoin works, they're going to know that this thing can't fail. So they'll be willing to give you loans against your Bitcoin at lower and lower interest rates because Bitcoin is the best asset in the world. The value of Bitcoin is going to keep rising. So banks will be able to create more and more money. They'll be able to expand the fiat economy significantly. And because of this, we're going to see more and more people wanting to own Bitcoin in order to borrow against it. But we may see at some point that governments confiscate the Bitcoin that you use as collateral. So if you were to borrow money against your Bitcoin, you'd have to give that Bitcoin to someone else to hold so that if you don't pay back your loan, they can sell it into the market. We may also see that some of these lenders go bankrupt. I don't know what would happen. I don't know what could happen. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on this topic, but if that happens, you would lose your Bitcoin. The lender will probably have to sell your Bitcoin in order to use in court proceedings, and you wouldn't owe them any more debt. The reason why I say that you shouldn't borrow against your entire Bitcoin stack is that if you borrow against a small amount and you have Bitcoin on the side in self-custody or in any other way of holding it, you can top up the amount of Bitcoin that you have as collateral. So now let's say the value of your Bitcoin collateral drops from $3,000 to $1,500. It's dropped by 50%. You can add more Bitcoin to your stack to bring this back up to $3,000. So you'd have to add $1,500 worth of Bitcoin to your collateral with your lender in order to prevent your lender from liquidating your Bitcoin. So I think that there's a point where it would be appropriate to borrow against your Bitcoin. If you can keep 5% of your Bitcoin as collateral, and then you borrow 50% against that, you'd have another 95% on the side in case you need to top up your collateral account. So in this case, if you want to borrow $1,500 against 5% of your total stack, you'd have to have $60,000 worth of Bitcoin. So in a way, this means that you're borrowing 2.5% of your entire stack. I think if you were to borrow against more than this, you're kind of putting yourself at risk. So let's say you have $60,000 worth of Bitcoin and you want to use $30,000 of it as collateral and you borrow $15,000 against it. You have a loan to value of 50%. You've borrowed 50% of your total Bitcoin. If this were to drop by 50%, let's say this falls to $15,000, the amount of Bitcoin that you have also drops by $15,000. So you can add another $15,000 to this amount. You now have zero. So if Bitcoin's value were to drop 75%, you would lose everything that you've used as collateral. Over time, I do think that you're going to see loans that are not marked to market with Bitcoin, just like mortgages. I think at some point you're going to see mortgages against Bitcoin. Right now, these mortgages are against real estate. You can borrow as much money as you want to against real estate. You can borrow up to 80% of the value of your real estate. But at some point, Bitcoin is going to be so deeply ingrained in society that we're going to see a lot of major banks offering mortgages against your Bitcoin because they're going to want your Bitcoin. They're going to offer you low interest rates, let's say 2, 3% instead of the 6% that you pay for a mortgage right now. If you can stack Bitcoin right now, you're buying an asset that's going to give you access to all of these loans in the future. The reason why I think this is going to happen is because Bitcoin is a much better asset than real estate. There's no subjectivity. Once you have Bitcoin, you have Bitcoin. One Bitcoin equals to one Bitcoin. If you use one Bitcoin as collateral and you borrow 0.05 Bitcoin worth of US dollars against it, you're going to see that your bank is going to give you a much lower interest rate because they know that if you don't pay back their loan, they can just sell your Bitcoin. They also know that the value of Bitcoin is going to go up forever because it's the only asset that has a finite supply. Real estate does not have a finite supply. The value of real estate can decrease over time because the supply can increase and it can wear and tear. Bitcoin can't wear and tear. There's no subjectivity. There's no maintenance. There's no appraisals. There's none of that that has to be done. Your bank doesn't have to worry about whether or not your property gets destroyed. As long as they have the Bitcoin in cold storage, they're willing to give you any loan that you want. You have to rely on them giving back your Bitcoin. That's a problem though, because they may not want to do that. And this goes back to governments confiscating your Bitcoin. If it's held by a centralized authority, they can easily take your Bitcoin. So just like everything else, when it comes to Bitcoin, you have to think about the positives and the negatives. You have to think about the pros and cons. When you borrow against your Bitcoin, you have to know what could potentially happen to put you in a bad position. If you borrow against your entire stack could get liquidated and you may be left with 0 Bitcoin. If there's just one scam wick down, you're going to see Bitcoin's price fall 50, 60% overnight. Your entire stack is liquidated. You now have 0 Bitcoin. Bitcoin's price is back up to where it was to begin with, and you've lost a significant amount of your wealth. You have to be a lot more conservative when you borrow against Bitcoin because it's more volatile and you don't want to lose your entire stack. So while I've said before that I don't like the idea of borrowing against Bitcoin, I think it's fine in certain situations. If you have a big enough stack, let's say you have $100 million worth of Bitcoin, you use $1 million worth as collateral, you use that as a line of credit, and whenever you need money, you borrow against it. If your bank takes that Bitcoin, it's fine. You haven't had to sell your Bitcoin. You can continue to use your Bitcoin as collateral until the legacy financial system collapses. I think this is going to change everything. It gives the poor access to an asset that can be used as collateral and they can borrow against the asset that they have and they can improve their lifestyles just like the rich do today. The most important step you can take is, of course, buy Bitcoin. You don't have to borrow against it right away. Just make sure that you have at least a little bit of Bitcoin, whether you have 0.01 or 0.1 or one whole Bitcoin. Whatever amount of Bitcoin you have, just set it aside, keep it safe. If you don't want to borrow against it right now, perfectly fine. But if the fiat currency financial system continues for the next 50 to 100 years, you may not want to sell your Bitcoin. You can use your Bitcoin as collateral. You can pay for things with the money that you borrow against your Bitcoin, and you never have to sell it again, making it almost like a speculative attack against the fiat currency financial system. Again, the very first step here is to buy Bitcoin. If you don't have any Bitcoin, you can't even think about this. This isn't even a possibility. Whatever amount of Bitcoin you can afford, just get your hands on it. I think that over the next 10, 15 years, you're going to be very happy with the results.